PQ. So declared revenue is declared price into declared quantity. But undeclared revenue is under-invoiced price into quantity plus under-invoiced quantity into price plus under-invoiced price into under-invoiced quantity. So there's a huge amount of understated revenue. Okay? Similarly, costs are shown to be high. What are costs? Raw materials, wages and salaries, purchase services, interest paid and depreciation. And on everything I'm budget. So people say businesses in India go bust, but the management prospers because the management is taking out. So he'll declare his house as the company's guest house, he'll declare his telephone as the company's telephone, he'll declare his servants as the company's peon. So entire household, if he goes for 5-star hotels, that's the entertainment expense of the company. If he goes for vacation to Europe, he'll say travel cost. So entire cost is put on the company. So these are different elements of cost. But the most important thing is that wages are overstated. So what happened in Satyam's case? 12,000 fictitious employees whose wages were being drawn. In MCD, out of 37,000 overstated employees. Okay. So wages are always shown higher and profits are always shown lower. What is the implication? Our national income distribution is incorrect. Because on paper we have a certain profit and certain wages, but those wages are inflated, the profits are shown higher, so our income distribution is much worse than what actually the white economy shows. That is the implication. Okay, so wages are always inflated. And how are wages inflated? Different kinds of mechanisms. Muster road fudging, which is what this NDMC case or this case of Satyam was showing. But like my one of my friends who didn't do so well, he's a teacher in a university teaching management, and he says only when I take 40,000 rupees to the management do I get a check of 80,000, which is the UGC scale. So that means wages are shown to be higher, and it's being made. The same happens in many private schools also, where what is paid officially by check only after you have paid in cash a certain amount to the management. Okay. So like this, wages are fudged in different. Okay. So these are some of the consequences of misstatement of employment and wages. That is the output labor ratio. Now these are all very important for planning, all these ratios. I'm not going to go into that slightly technical, but these ratios are all incorrect in the economy, and therefore it affects our planning process. Okay. Now, given all these impacts, therefore it affects the entire macroeconomy. Failure of planning. Okay. Because you're planning for the wrong amount, your output labor ratio is incorrect, your incremental capital output ratio is wrong, your incremental capital, input output ratio is wrong, etc. So because of all that planning, resource mobilization, if your black economy is 50% of GDP, then you are missing out 20% of GDP as taxes, and you're collecting 15%. That means your tax collection would have more than doubled if the black economy had been vibrant rather than that. So today your fiscal deficit, okay, total fiscal deficit of about say 10% would have been a surplus of 10%. And therefore when we say we have shortage of money for Manrega or for subsidy or for say education or for health, this would not have been there. We should be spending 6% of GDP on education, but we are not able to cross 4%. Mostly we are hanging around 3.4 to 3.8%. Okay? But education is very crucial for the future of the country. So we are not spending adequately on education. Why? Because we are not collecting resources from the black economy. Okay? Black economy is outside the government's net, so resources don't come in. Okay. Now growth and stagnation. When I say stagnation, I mean 5% less growth. And in 70s, when we were growing at 3.5%, people said, Hindu rate of growth. But why Hindu rate of growth? Because of the black economy. If the black economy had not been there, we would have been growing at 8.5% then, just like the newly industrializing countries of Southeast Asia were growing. Okay? Their whole growth path was because in the 60s they took off. Okay? Their rate of growth went up. Okay? Then income distribution effect. Black economy is concentrated in the hands of 3%. So 97% suffered the ill effect of this with a 3% gain out of. investment, unemployment, and the multiplier is affected, as I showed. Inflation. Inflation is very, in a key way, driven by black coin. Why? Because all your costs are inflated. So whenever you do pricing based on your cost, what is called markup pricing, then your markup remaining the same, your price will be higher. Or what you can alternatively think of, black premium on a lot of things. And wastage. And finally, the fiscal policy, because people are not paying direct taxes, so you have more indirect taxes. So in India by 1991, 87% of all taxes were indirect taxes. Only 13%. Even now, 50% of taxes indirect taxes. And indirect taxes tend to be stagflationary. They tend to raise. So every time excise fee goes up, sales tax goes up, service tax goes up, prices go up. Okay. And then demand tends to stagnate. That's why indirect taxes tend to be stagflationary. And we have very high indirect taxes in India. Okay. So that effect is very, very important, and that's because of the black coin. Okay. Now, because of the black coin, there are various budgetary deficits. So budget deficit, which is now equated to zero because we don't have borrowing from RBI anymore. But budget deficit used to be an important category. Revenue deficit because of black coin. Fiscal deficit because of black coin. Primary deficit because of black coin. So budgetary deficits are because of that. And why debt trap? Because when you have a revenue deficit, that means on your current account you have a deficit. You have to borrow for current expenses. So you're like a bonded laborer. Bonded laborer borrows for consumption, then next year has to borrow more for paying back and more for consumption, and therefore your debt keeps on increasing. So Government of India is also borrowing for current expenses. Suppose you have a subsidy, you can't earn a return on it, right? So if your deficit is because of subsidy, then your debt will keep going up. Defense or other administrative expenses, those are all current account items. If there is a deficit on the current account, then you are not able to earn a return. See, there is no problem in borrowing. All industry runs on borrowing. Working capital and other capital is all borrowed. But they are earning a return to pay back the money. But on the current account, when the government does not earn money, then its debt will keep on increasing. So revenue deficit is supposed to be the most crucial deficit. Once the revenue deficit is there, then you have to borrow more, and therefore your fiscal deficit rises, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the debt trap is also there. The rising transaction costs are also there because of that problem. Because everything slows down. So transaction costs are high in the economy. And when transaction costs are higher, inflation will be higher. Okay, so we have a high cost economy in spite of low wages. Savings and investment rates I have already discussed. Consumption propensity falls. Export, import and BOP are affected. You have smuggling. You have under-invoicing or export, over-invoicing or import. So export data, import data and balance of payment data are grossly in error. Okay. But we continue to function with that. So we have a current account deficit, whereas actually we are losing capital, so we should have had a current account surplus. So a current account surplus is converted to a current account deficit, and that's why the balance of payment is. Now, import propensity also rises because of the black economy, but I won't go into that. Monetary policy is affected, as I was telling you earlier, because RBI ignored the black economy and the black liquidity that is circulating. So therefore, the monetary policy gets affected. It opens up the economy. Because capital is going in and coming out through hawala, through under-invoicing, over-invoicing. So economy is behaving like an open economy, but formally the government says we don't have capital account convertibility. So its policies turn out to be wrong. Before 1991, when you didn't even have trade account convertibility, the capital was going in and out. So you had capital account convertibility for the black economy before 1991. But we were treating the economy as a closed economy. So the policy failure is linked to that, because the economy is not what you are claiming it to be. So policy failure and capital fight are linked to that. It reduces the effectiveness of state intervention. Why? Because wherever the state spends, that money is not properly spent or is wasted. So state becomes ineffective. State's rig doesn't run because of the existence of black economy. And then this is a consequence that follows from now. Okay. Now, there has been massive flight of capital. Now there are all kinds of figures that are bandied about. One figure which is going around by chain mail. for the last 6 years is that Indians hold $1.4 trillion in Swiss banks. Widely circulated mail, it's come to me at least a few hundred times in the last 6-7 years, because everybody is forwarding. So people begin to believe that that's correct, but it cannot be correct. Because there are 77 tax havens. Switzerland is the best known. So if it is one tax haven has $1.4 trillion in the 77, there must be huge sums of money. Okay, you have Cayman Island, you have Jersey, you have Saint Kitts, you have Saint Lucia, you have Hawaii, you have Singapore, you have Dubai, you have all kinds of places, including in USA. There's one state which behaves like a tax haven, where very little tax and very high secrecy is there. Okay. So this cannot be correct. Now, Global Financial Integrity has come up with a figure of $462 billion as a loss of capital. But this is a gross underestimate. Why? Because it does not take into account hawala, it does not take into account narcotic drugs, it does not take into account transfer pricing. So many items are left. So we don't know how much has gone out, but at least my estimate is maybe the opportunity cost of capital loss is $2 to $3 trillion. It's a very high estimate. And one of my MPhil students who's correcting some of these errors in the Global Financial Integrity one, he's coming up with a figure of about $2.5 trillion from 1948 to 2010. So it's a very large number. So if this $2.5 trillion had not been lost to the economy, if this opportunity cost had not been there, then today your Indian industry would have been 5 times larger than it is. Private sector industry. So private sector industry which employs 7.5 or 8 million people could have employed 40 million people. Okay. So your employment would have been higher by 32 million, and your educated unemployment in the labor exchanges is also by 35 million. So entire educated unemployment would have been wiped out if the black economy had not been there and this money had been invested in India rather than flying abroad through flight. Secondly, your debt, foreign debt, in 1991, when your foreign debt had risen to $93 billion and you were about to default, okay, through the black economy it already lost an opportunity cost of more than $1 trillion. So instead of having a debt of $93 billion, you would have had a surplus of $907 billion. Okay. So black economy is the key reason for your balance of payment problem. The flight of capital through various mechanisms, under-invoicing, over-invoicing, hawala and so on and so forth. And it therefore results in shortage of capital. Because, like the British used to take capital out through drain of wealth, our businessmen and politicians and so on are taking capital out of the country. So what was happening under the British because of colonization is now happening because of black economy. Okay? Only the actors have changed. And therefore a country which is very poor, which is supposed to be capital short, is exporting capital. So this is a contradiction. Then apart from these macroeconomic policy things, there is a microeconomic impact. So different aspects of policy failure, whether it's education, health, drinking water scheme, all kinds of micro policies have failed because of the black economy. You are supposed to have pipes that are well laid, okay, but they are poorly laid, they suck in sewage, okay, so everybody now carries this bottled water. So you have this dual expenditure. First you spend money on cleaning up water, but you can't trust it, so everybody has to buy bottled water. Or have RO systems and aqua guards and various other things. So this increases your capital cost. Now social sectors therefore are in very bad shape. Okay. In Delhi, whichever direction you go out in the morning, fields are littered with people because people don't have toilets. And they are sitting in very filthy conditions. So in India, the conditions of existence of vast majority are very, very uncivilized. This kind of condition exists only in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, nowhere else. So this is a result of the black economy which undermines our social sector, which undermines the efficiency of social sector policy. There's growing criminalization in society because of black economy. Why? Because illegality has spread in every activity. So criminalization has spread, and I'll come back to this. There's impact on national security. The security agencies are worried that policymakers will sell the policies for a small sum from some MNC or some foreign company. Social waste. There's massive amount of wastage. You know, it's like what I characterize digging holes and filling holes. So during the daytime you dig a hole and at night time you fill it. So two people have earned income but zero output is there. So this is what I call activity without productivity. So you go to a court and thousands of people are milling around, but the judge will give a next date. So people are wasting time. So wherever you go, you find in India, work is not getting done even though people are busy gossiping, talking, they're in the offices, but work is not getting done. So this is like digging holes and filling, which results in activity without productivity. So we have low level of productivity in our system because, like I can see in the hospitals in JNU, you know, half the time fellows are playing cards. You know, they're not doing whatever they're supposed to do. So they'll do a slipshod job. You know, where if they're supposed to be doing cleaning, they'll do a little bit of cleaning and then they'll play cards. If they're supposed to be cooks, etc., they'll do a little bit of work. They won't keep the mess clean and so on. In the US, a friend of mine was working in a restaurant. And he will tell me he is allowed to sit for 20 minutes in an 8-hour duty. Because the owner would tell him, I'm paying you for work, not for sitting down. A nurse is allowed to sit for only 20 minutes in an 8-hour job. She can't sit for more than 20 minutes. She has to be on her feet. So he would tell me that if there's no client, then I'm supposed to be cleaning up the counter, the glasses, and the tables, etc. I can't sit. You know? So work ethic in India is very, very, very poor. Now, you see that work ethic is not only poor among workers, the work ethic is very poor even among the professionals. So a chartered accountant will sign on the dotted line, not look at the account. That's why Satyam case, even though a multinational company was a chartered accountant, they didn't catch. How did 6,000 crores of fictitious fixed deposits come about? Because the chartered accountant is paid by the owner, they sign on anything. So chartered accountants are the go-in-between for corruption between the income tax department and the client. Okay. So chartered accountants are not interested in their work. Doctors are not interested in curing you because the more you come, the more fees they'll get. The more tests they prescribe, the more cuts they'll get. If I as a teacher teach you well, you won't come to me for tuition. So I should teach you badly. So children first go to class, they don't understand because the teacher is not teaching well, then they have to go for tuition. And this is not new. In 62, when I was in Ramjas number 5, the physics teacher in the class used to say, 40 rupees ki gaddi lagwa le to students. So it's not a new phenomenon, it's an old phenomenon where teachers do tuition, okay, to make extra money. So parents have to pay, but teaching is not good. So imagine the plight of a child, he doesn't understand the material in the class, he thinks it's difficult, loses interest, then has to come home instead of playing, he has to spend time and try to understand it, and the parents will insist on some tuition or some coaching or something. So child is spending twice the time and still not understanding things properly, mugging up. Okay. So imagine the impact it has on children's interest in education. That's why most children find schools dull. You know, they don't learn there. Very few are able to then do. So our training is very poor. And that's because of the work ethic. But I mean, suffice it to say, a policeman will collect hafta, is busy collecting hafta rather than, taking care of law and order. Because the more the disorder, the more hafta he can collect. The more the encroachment, the more the hafta. So for my book, when I did a interview with one of the Home Secretaries, he said, every additional police station in Delhi means more crime. Because that forces auction of the SHO. Okay. And then the beat constable has to generate that income. Okay. How do you generate that income? By allowing illegality to flourish. So, in one case, a friend of mine who was an MP from Madhya Pradesh, there was a theft in her house when she was in Delhi. So she was very upset. This is about 5-6 years back. So she went there. The police next day brought the television and 1 or 2 items saying these were lost. She said, this is not my television. You have to get me my television. Next day they brought her television. That means they knew who the thief was, where they could locate the thief, and where they could get the TV back. Okay. My wife, had a small mishap at the railway station. She's a highly connected, she's a very well-known journalist. She's on TV all the time. So she called to the PMO at 12 midnight saying this is what has happened. They called the police. Next morning there's a phone call, and she had gone to drop me, I had gone somewhere. So she told me next morning there's a phone call from somebody saying, "Man, your purse is lying here in a market some 15 kilometers from JNU." She went there and she found her purse. The money was gone, but other things were all inside. You see, the police know who these people are at the railway station, who these people are in the big pockets and so on. So there's a nexus that is there. That's why criminalization is growing.
But only thing is the police find it for the interest of people.
Exactly. So, but they show that they know.
Yes.
They're in league. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Same thing happened with me also.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, we can narrate many such incidents. So the point is that therefore collective action is now difficult. Alienation, people say, apna karo, forget everything else. You know, I don't know what's going to happen where, but let me build my network to help myself. So collective action, which used to be very important in the country till the 70s and the early 80s, is now declined. People say, do it for yourself, forget it. And the final thing, therefore the usual is the unusual and the unusual is the usual. What does it mean? That which should happen does not happen. That which should not happen keeps happening. So you should get 220 volt electricity, you get 170 or 270, your equipment will burn out. And you need to have extra voltage stabilizer. Okay? Your water should be clean in the tap, but the water may be dirty and you may get cholera, you may get typhoid, and therefore you have additional expenses. So where all do you fight? If you see a few things were wrong, you could fight. But if a vast number of things around you are wrong, then how do you fight it? So people give up and people join in. So if you can make some black somewhere, you do that. Okay. Now, it therefore results in debating the wrong questions because we're not tackling the black economy. We're not looking at the analytics of black economy. So we're all the time debating the wrong questions, public sector versus private sector. Both are inefficient in India because of the black economy. Organized sector versus unorganized sector. Both become inefficient because of the black economy. Capital versus labor. But the inefficiency of the black economy is far greater than the inefficiency of capital or labor. So we're not discussing the right question. And therefore it becomes ideological. If I'm of the left, I'll protect one. If I'm of the right, I'll protect the other. But we're not looking at the bigger problem. What is the bigger problem? Okay. Now, so much is wrong. The question is we should do something. But as I said, if I have to remedy a problem, I must know the correct cause. So what are the causes of existence of black economy? Okay. In the literature, there are these causes that are given. Now, in economics, sometimes things are not intuitive. Now, high tax rate seems to be a cause. If tax rates are high, I'll rate taxes. But it has been shown that this is not the cause of black income. In 1971, when Mrs. Gandhi was a finance minister, the highest marginal tax rate was 97.5%. And for anybody with an income of above 15 lakhs, including wealth tax, the tax rate became 102%. So you could not have an income of above 15 lakh in 1971. Okay. Tax rates have come down dramatically since then. Now we're at 30% plus some surcharge. Okay. But black economy has grown. In 1970, one estimated to be 7% of GDP. Now it's more than 50% of GDP. So tax rates have come down. Black economy has grown. Okay. The reason is, you see, black economy is systematic and systemic, as you see. Okay? Tax rates don't matter. I set up a system for evading black income. Whether the tax rate is 90% or 20%, I'll evade. Because I'll save that much. So tax rates, neither internationally nor nationally, are shown to be the reason. And you can see from this, bulk of the population is hardly there in the tax rate. Okay? So, high tax rate hypothesis neither empirically nor theoretically holds. Similarly, people say degree of controls and regulations is important for black income generation. And this also seems obvious that wherever there is regulation and controls, people get bend the rules. But the question that I ask in my book is, can a regulation or can a law be its own cause of violation? So suppose we have an intersection where there are red lights. So can we say red light existence is the cause of why people are jumping the red light? No. Red light is there to regulate traffic, otherwise you will have traffic jam. Like in Delhi, most people are so aggressive that they'll not give right away. So the moment lights break down, there's a traffic jam. So traffic lights are for a social purpose. So regulations and controls and laws are for a social purpose. They cannot be the own cause of violation. Why do people violate something? Because they commit an illegality. Jumping a traffic light is an illegality. Or diverting PDS grain is an illegality. So the cause is illegality. The source can be PDS. The source can be police corruption. So cause and source have to be distributed. So tax evasion is a source but not the cause. Violation of controls and regulations is a source but not the cause. The cause lies in the illegality. Why the question is, has illegality grown so much? And this is where I come to the question of the triad. What is this triad? See, when black economy is 50% of GDP, it means 50% of economic activity involves some kind of illegality. So why is illegality so rampant? Illegality can be only so rampant if those who are in charge of the state, of the government, they are parties. So the political class, the executive class and the business class together form the triad to generate the triad. Okay. Now this triad formed at the time of elections. And in my book for 98 elections, I interviewed 14 members of parliament who succeeded and who are good friends of mine. They gave me the actual election expenditure data. Two of them were former prime ministers, three of them were ministers then, one of them is a chief minister now, three of them are ministers now. So a very representative sample of people from East India, West India, North India, South India. So they gave that, so the actual election expenditure at that time was an average of 1.3 crores, when the expenditure limit was 15 lakhs. So spending 8 times more. And bulk of this expenditure was on illegal activity. There was last 3 days 35% expenditure on booze, on kambas, on dhotis, and all kinds of things.
Now electronic items.
Whatever, electronic item, but that's legal also. They're legally giving also. Right? But this is illegal. What is legally given as state policy is a different matter. So the point is that a lot of this is illegal. So even if you had, state funding of elections, this illegal expense cannot be allowed of state funding. So it will come. But the point is, I asked what are the sources of finance of this election. So big business, small local businesses, big politicians, local traders, all these. And all of them admitted that they are getting this money because they'll get quid pro quo. And interestingly, they also said the bribed journalists. So this paid news phenomenon is already described in my book in 1999. Then they also said that corrupt judges, corrupt policemen and corrupt bureaucrats also give us money. Because they know that when we get to power, we get prize posted. Okay. This was admitted. And they also admitted that we begin day one in parliament with a lie. We know we have spent much more, but we only give accounts saying only 15 lakhs or so. Okay. So this triad is very important. Okay. And this executive consists of police, bureaucracy and judiciary. There is massive corruption in judiciary. Okay. Now the Bhushan has said 8 of the former chief justices have been corrupt and cases are going on against Balakrishnan and this Sabharwal. Okay. These are recent, but according to them 8 of the former chief justices, you can imagine. And I used to sit in the Seezari court observing the kind of corruption for bailiffs, for process servers, for everything that has been. Okay. So massive corruption in the lower levels of judiciary, but it goes right up to the Supreme Court. Okay. Now, according to B.D. Kumar, who was the Customs Intelligence Chief, he wrote a book in 1990. According to that book, criminals entered the nexus from 1983. So why 1983? That is the year amnesty was given to smugglers. And since that time, either the businessman is a criminal or the politician is a criminal. And that's why I have a large number of people with criminal cases who are entering legislation. And businessmen, are bordering on criminality. Because what you can get legally, you can get much more illegally by manipulating policy. So you have control over policy maker, that's one important thing, and that's why all the politicians admitted that there's a big quid pro quo. Okay, so this has led to rapid growth of criminalization in society. So this linkages, this triad, is impervious to criminal activity because it uses criminal activity as a part of its operation. Now, this has weakened the rule of law in the country. And in 1984, when we were doing the CBDT study for NIPFP, we sent a questionnaire to all commissioners of income tax in the country, and they were mandatory to reply to it. And in that sample, they said 95% of their department is correct. Today that figure may be 99. In 2002, in the MCD case in Delhi, the Senate farm case, the judge scolded the MCD lawyer, saying, how come you're not able to check the illegality in the Senate farm area? So in the court, the lawyer said, sir, we don't have a single honest public works department engineer left in our department. We don't have a single honest. This is stated in the court. So you can imagine the extent of, corruption that is being formally admitted by those who are actually there. So this is the kind of okay. So now, given all this, what is the nature of our laws? Laws on paper and laws as they are completely different. So on paper we have wonderful laws against child marriage, against child labor, etc. But in our homes and so on, child labor flourishes. In the dhabas, child labor flourishes. Okay. So laws as they are on paper and as they are implemented are completely, different. Now, the point is that no perfect law is feasible. You see, law is law both in letter and spirit. So any law can be circumvented if the spirit is not willing. And human ingenuity is clever enough to circumvent. So for instance, in India we have implemented thousands of things. But each time you find the laws, quickly the people find a way to circumvent them. So unless we as a nation decide to become law abiding, it will not work. And I give you one example, again an anecdotal example. So you see, my nephew was getting married in the US. So my sister wanted a lot of sweets. So we bought very expensive sweets. That time in 2003, 500, 700 rupees a kilo. Now, of course, 500, 700 may not be that expensive. But we took 10 kilos of sweets. Now, when we were approaching the US, we had to give a customs declaration that we are carrying food stuff and so on. So I said, we are carrying food stuff, so we should declare it. My wife said, no, we shouldn't declare it because they'll confiscate it. So I said, cooked food, because that's what mithai and all is, cooked food. And we went. Now when we reached Pittsburgh, where my sister stays, all Indians said, Arun, you are wrong to have done this. You should have done what? All Americans said, Arun, you did the right. It's a mindset. See, bending rules. We are, all the time bending rules, playing with rules. So as I say, what's the use of being in power if I can't bend rules for myself? If I'm not in power, I can't bend rules for myself. But if I'm in power, I should be able to bend rules. So therefore, this has become an attitudinal problem in the country, that we are all the time bending rules. Whether it be as a government servant, whether I remember the 60s, my uncles who were in the IS, they would be very careful. They would not use it for private phone. They would not use the office car for sending their child to school or for the wife to go to shopping. But it's routine now. It's not accepted as an illegality. But we are committing illegal. So what is legal and what is illegal has constantly changed. So rules can be this thing, and ingenuity can always circumvent them. Okay. Now, political aspects are very important because above all the problem is political. And Radia tapes exposes this triad. So formation of triad, very clear. Politicians, and it has added journalists, the top journalists as a part of that triad. Okay. Intelligence exists, but it is used for blackmailing politicians. So like if you want on presidential elections, you want Mulayam Singh Yadav to behave, you just have to show him the file. If Mayawati behaves, the Taj corridor case can be opened, closed or reopened and reclosed, okay? So political blackmail. Honesty cannot be individual. Honesty, you can't say I'll be financially clean, but I'll tolerate all the corruption, political, social corruption, etc. So honesty has to be individual. But unfortunately, we play around with these things. And there's complete lack of democracy in our political party. Okay. Corruption cases are knowingly spoiled. So when you take Hassan Ali case of 2007, he wasn't arrested. It was $8 billion on the hard disk in the HSBC account there. Pranab Mukherjee in 2011 said only $60,000 left. Now he's not a fool. By a click of a mouse, you can transfer money. Okay. So Hassan Ali couldn't proceed because they paid for this thing. Liechtenstein disk, where 26 names were there. This LPG bank, where one Mr. Kleibe sold the data to the German government for 4 million euros. That disk we did not accept for a very long time. We only accepted 3 years later. 2G case from 2007 on. So the cases get spoiled knowingly. And this needs to be contrasted with the Birkenfeld case, the UBS case in the US. Birkenfeld was one private banker traveling between Zurich and New York. And the income tax department got curious. They tracked the people he was visiting, got them, got evidence, okay, and he was prosecuted. And the UBS was prosecuted and had to give 4,500 names out of the 52,000 names that it had, plus $750 million of fines. And this case was over in 6 months. Okay. Now similarly, Raju's case, Satyam's case is continuing. At that time, Harry Madoff's case came in the US. 6 months he was behind bars. Raju's case is just about starting. Okay, 4 years down the line, 3 years down the line. Raj Ratnam case, 2 months he was behind bars. Okay, Raju's case is continuing. Rajat Gupta's case in 2 months, decision is there. Okay, but in our case, years and years go by and no decision, and cases are deliberately spoiled. So the question is remedy. They've had at least 40 committees and commissions of different kinds which have gone into different aspects of the black economy. At least 40. There are estimate committee, there are, Santhanam committee, Vanchu committee, LK Jha committee, PC Alexander committee. They've all looked at different aspects of the black economy. Latest being the Showman, the Kelkar committee. And they made thousands of suggestions. Vanchu committee is rich with suggestions, hundreds of suggestions are there. And we've implemented a large number of them. So we have used demonetization of currency, we have tried voluntary disclosure schemes 6 times, we have decreased tax rates, we have reduced controls and regulations. MRTP is gone, FERA is gone, small scale reservation is almost gone. So whatever the industry wanted has been done after 1995. State funding of elections has been suggested, so all kinds of things have been suggested. But nothing is working and the size of black economy is increasing. The reason is that none of them affect the triad which underlies the black income generation. So if you have, say, voluntary disclosure, then according to the CAG report on 1997 voluntary disclosure scheme, okay, same people declared their money in the earlier 5 schemes than in the 6 schemes. So it is said that people have become habitual tax offenders because they know that another scheme will come and they will widen their money. Mauritius route was deliberately provided by the Ministry of Finance for round tripping to take place. So money that had gone out earlier can come back through the Mauritius route without paying taxes. Okay. So that's a voluntary disclosure scheme for foreign health accounts. And voluntary disclosure scheme is for Indian accounts. Okay. So even though the government has given an undertaking to the Supreme Court in 1997 that we will not have any voluntary disclosure schemes henceforth, but still debating that we should have another voluntary disclosure scheme, and there's pressure for having another voluntary. But as Vanchu committee showed, this makes honest people into dishonest. Because there are 2 businessmen, one is making black, the other is making white. He's paying 65% tax in the 70s. This fellow is not paying tax. So his capital is growing fast, his capital is growing slowly. And then in voluntary disclosure, he widens it. So this fellow feels, why should I be the only fool? So I should also generate that. So honest people become dishonest. So that's what Vanchu committee in 1978 already said we should never have voluntary disclosure. But we continue to have it because voluntary disclosure scheme is like saying what? I'm not able to control theft, so let me legalize theft. If I legalize theft, then I can say my theft statistics have gone down to 0.
God can also partially do this by people donating in Hindi.
Yes, all kinds of things. People are donating in temples and mosques and wherever. So these are all the analytical aspects that I have highlighted to you. the savings rate, the multiplier, the growth.
But go back to the solution slide.
What is needed?
What is needed? The earlier slide is showing what.
Well, as I said, you have to break the triad. Okay? The only way you can break the triad is bringing accountability and transparency at every level. Okay? Which means right to information is crucial, and it must be for business also. Because business is the key through which the black income is generated. But as Raju's case shows, you can have any kind of independent director, it doesn't matter. Because independent director just sign on the dotted line. So business accountability is very, very crucial. Political accountability is very crucial, but political parties don't have elections. Who can criticize Sonia Gandhi? Who can criticize Thackeray? If you are a nephew of Thackeray, you criticize, you're out of the party. You know? So there is no inner party democracy, and when this leader becomes the leader in the parliament or in the legislature, he's not going to be democratic, he's going to be manipulative. So therefore, political accountability is crucial. Without political accountability, this black economy cannot be effective. So in other words, it's like saying democracy needs to be strengthened. Okay. So, cost to society are very high. Transparency and accountability at all levels are needed. Principles are needed. Today the principle is what suits me is a principle and what doesn't suit me is not a principle. Okay? So everything is defined on the basis of self rather than on the basis of society. So good is marginalized. Suppose you are a good guy, I am a bad guy. You say, hey, ये तो मेरा काम कर देगा. So why? But this fellow can give me trouble, so keep him happy. So you marginalize the good in today's society. We need strong RTI, and Lokpal is required for only the top echelon. You can't have a Lokpal for everybody. Because then you'll have a parallel bureaucracy which will also get corrupted. But if you can get accountability in the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice of India at the center, and Chief Minister and the High Court Chief Justice in the state, accountability will filter down. If Manmohan Singh can say, I will not have Raja because of this reports about him, it wouldn't have happened. But the weakness of Manmohan Singh was he's not accountable to anybody. Chief Justice of India is not accountable to anybody. You bring in accountability of the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice of India at the center, every minister has to be accountable, every judge of the Supreme Court and the High Court will have to be accountable. But you're not insisting. Judges will give you dates. In one case I noticed, in 2.5 years, 8 judges were changed. And none of them heard the case. One judge heard the case, the decision was there that day. So cases, 4 crore cases are pending in the court because judges are not accountable to anybody. So you need accountability of the judiciary. Okay. Without movement, laws remain on paper. So strong movement. So Lokpal I support because there's a movement around it. Not because what they are saying is the correct thing. But you need movement. Because of the pressure of the Lokpal movement, 4 cabinet ministers and the cabinet secretary went to meet Baba Ramdev at the airport. What is this? It's pressure. Governments will work under pressure. Okay? They, for Anna Hazare, because of fast and massive uproar, they came under pressure and they did all these things. So why DTAA and this tax information exchange treaties, etc. All this is show. Because now the government wants to show that they are doing something. Okay? But the very people in the government are people who are making money. So they don't want to actually do it, but they want to show that they are doing something. So we need new parties and new politics. And turning point may come when all the different movements get together. See, that's what the lesson of national movement is. National movement, in 1857, the British broke the resistance of India by hanging bodies every day. Till 1885, there was no organized political activity. And then Congress was set up as a debating club by David Hume and Annie Besant. It's just a debating club. This is the 1890s that movements in Bengal and Punjab and Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, they started getting together. It's only in 1907 that we asked for Dominion state. It's only in 1927 that we asked for Poon Swaraj, 70 years ago. And we got independence in 1947, 90 years ago. So movements are a way of growing, and the movements will have right to information, right to education, right to livelihood, etc., etc., and all kinds of movements. If they get together over a period of time, as movements tend to do, then you have a transformation. Then new political parties, etc., will come. And this is where you see the UK example is very important. a strong public opinion. They don't have a written constitution. So MPs who are misusing their MP lad kind of fund there for personal gain, they have to resign. Because it was caught. So that is the kind of accountability without any written constitution. And I'll close with this Bali Ramayana. Has anybody seen the Bali Ramayana or heard of it? What is the Bali Ramayana? It is enacted by all men and all in lungi, check, black and white. And the interesting thing is that Ram shoots an arrow and Ravan falls. But the next moment he brushes himself, gets up and starts fighting again. The other word is the fight between good and evil is not one shot. Our fight in our Ramayana is one shot, he is killed. So evil is eliminated. But in Bali Ramayana, the good and the evil coexist and they keep on fighting. It's not a one shot fight. So that is why movements are important, because movements change the mindset. We all have good and bad intentions. Which will win will depend on what our local and immediate circumstances are. So in other words, Bali Ramayana is very crucial. And my book ends with the Bali Ramayana, and that's why there are checks, this checkboard on the cover with the black king dominating. Yeah.
A lot of it seems to be purely, from Marxian perspective, purely a feudal structure we are not able to eliminate. The transition phase is lasting too long. And we are not even able to reach the Western civilization. You can say they have matured capitalist structure where you need transparency, because capitalism cannot thrive unless you have a transparent system. You have to have free the labor, and all the distribution also is a precondition for a coming out from feudal structure, which is grossly unequal to a relatively less equal capitalist structure. So a lot of it seems to be, unless we attack the feudal structure, a lot of these things basically are symptoms, which seems to be. Our movement has to be in a way capitalistic in nature. You can say that's
democratic. I don't equate democracy with capitalism. See, in the West, democracy and capitalism may have gone together because they both emerged roughly at the same time. But capitalism may not, like in many countries like in South Korea, etc., capitalism actually suppressed democracy. So democratic movement and capitalism don't go. So what I'm stressing is democracy. If people's accountability is there, if the system's accountability is there, if people rise up, then the system transforms. So it's a little bit more than just capitalism. Capitalism can be also very, very harsh, like for instance in the US. Today, inequalities, as the recent data shows, are greater than existed in the 1920s. Okay? So capitalism can be very unequal and can be very undemocratic. Okay? So what I'm emphasizing is that what we need is democratization. That's what my earlier slide said. That it's the need for democracy. Because democracy is accountability. Then if there's accountability, businesses will be accountable, bureaucracy will be accountable, judiciary will be accountable, political class will be accountable. Today if Lalu Yadav, after being caught, can make his wife the chief minister, he'll laugh at the public. Look, why should I care for you? You are electing me. Right? That's what all the corrupt people say. We have come through election. They tell the NGOs, have you come through election? Are you people's representatives? We are people's representatives. Right? So the weakness of our democracy, that propels the black economy. It's not just capitalism. I agree, it's feudal. We are very feudal in our mind. That's why you see when a policeman stops me, even though I have jumped a line, I know I've committed wrong, but I'll be, blatant. I'll say, don't you know my uncle is the IG police? I'll call him up. Don't you know such and such is the MP? I'll call him up. This is feudal attitude, right? So we are very feudal in our mind. Chair, I'm in position, so I'm important. So I'm feudal. So it's by birth. Feudalism is by birth, right? That's my right. Right? So similarly, chair is my right. So I can do wrong. And therefore a lot of wrong goes. So yes, we are very feudal minded. But the important thing is democracy, not capitalism.
Sir, capitalism or democracy being all components of the same feudal structure. So the title of your slide, what may work, itself is a little apologetic. May not. May work because essentially talking about boiling the whole ocean. Unless the whole country changes, everybody the
That's why movement. What may work, see, nobody can claim to have the ultimate truth. I mean, unlike Anna Hazare who says, I have the ultimate thing of this and look. We have to be a little circumspect. See, it's not that earlier generations didn't. JP movement was all against corruption. His Navnirman movement in 72 and then the student movement in 73 onward, right? So it's not the first time a movement against corruption has come. VP Singh's movement was also against corruption. So movements have come, but we haven't succeeded. That's why we have to be a little circumspect. We can't claim to have the ultimate truth. Okay? So on the basis of my analysis, I can say this is what may work. Right? But even ultimately this may not work, because you see that the ground is not prepared in the country. Right? See, when you try a step, like say for instance anti-defection. When did the Airam Gairam phenomenon start? In Haryana in 1967, in that election, Airam Gairam phenomenon started, right? Okay, then whole parties used to defect in North East. And we've tried so many modifications, but still people are defecting. So it's not one or two laws, we're talking about a mindset. That's why you see movements change. During national movement, people used to say that only 5% came out in 1942. 95% still didn't come out. Why? Because people said, how can we defeat the British? They rule over half the world, the sun never sets. So most people didn't believe, but when 5% came out, the country got independent. Right? So in a sense, it's a mindset thing.
Would you be able to put a hierarchy as to what should come first in terms of priority, so that can you identify a tipping point which will shift us?
I don't have any instant terms. You know, those are like people saying lower tax rate, things will happen, didn't happen. Reduce control, reduce control, didn't happen. State funding of elections. See, you can't have, it's a social. The whole purpose of this talk is to say it's not a purely economic phenomenon. It's economic, it's political, it's social. So it's embedded in your society. Today, when the entire elite classes, some form or the other, is involved in the black economy generation, then it's embedded in our society. And if I point a finger to you, right, and say you are corrupt, I'm also probably corrupt in some form. You know? So this has to be a collective conscience. That's why when people say that a lot of people who are corrupt have joined Anna Hazare's movement, but individually you can't fight it. So as long as you're willing to change yourself, you join a movement, when the big change takes place, you will also change. Till then you can't change yourself individually. It's very difficult in today's system to say, I'm not going to bribe you. You know, because there's so many places where you get trapped into, otherwise you'll be spending enormous amount of time just doing that. Right? So, individual solutions don't exist, collective solutions. That's what the message is.
But just a minute, sir, if I go back to my department, I'm part of the administrative reform structure. Which of this should be my first shot?
Okay, right to information
is practical solution.
Right to information is absolutely crucial in my judgment. The more, information should not be on the need to know basis, but should be freely available. Complete transparency, and you see a lot of things will change. In fact, a lot of information that has come out in the last 6-7 years is because of RTI.
Yes.
So RTI to me is absolutely crucial, and I've been fighting for right to information since '85. That's one thing that is very.
But is it getting?
As I said, accountability of the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice. I would go for Lokpal bill only for just the top 2 positions in the states and the center. Forget everything else. And if they become accountable, it will filter out. It won't filter out. So a small, focused Lokpal is a crucial thing to bring in accountability into our system. So I would go for these 2. Forget everything.
One thing to
No, one by one.
today the lecturers like our Amber is training to bring all the classmates outside back to India. So what do you think to give a proper direction for actually having that classmate back to India?
See, let me give a slightly detailed answer. According to my estimate, only 10% of black income generated in the country goes abroad. 90% is here. And how does that 10% go out? Except for some people who are foolish, who are immature, as Madhu Koda's case shows, they go out through what are called layering. What is layering? You take money out through shell companies. So you create one shell company in one tax haven, okay, and you can do it in say Cayman Islands, $2,500. You transfer money to second, you close this. You transfer from there to third country and close that. You transfer to fourth. 6th layer is where it's done. So in the mid-90s, when Beaufort money and all was being talked about, Adnan Khashoggi was known to have 2,700 companies at any given point in time. and he would provide services for transferring money to that. So money, if it is lying in Switzerland, is not lying in Arun Kumar's name. If Government of India asks, give me the information about Arun Kumar's Arun Kumar's bank account, Swiss government says Arun Kumar doesn't have an account here. Because it's in some trust name, it's in some shell company's name. So Bofo's money went to Lotus and to AE Services in the trail dried up. Okay? So unless you catch Potroki and he reveals, till then you can't know who got the Bofo's money. Money was paid because Artbo has agreed, money was paid, Swiss government has agreed that the money was paid, Indians have agreed money was paid, but who got it is not known. Right? That's the real question. And why should Potroki be so influential? So, and because in the Artbo diaries it was said G has to be saved. Okay, so that's why the blame fell on Rajiv Gandhi. And Rajiv Gandhi didn't start action when the first thing broke on the Swedish radio. He did not initiate any action in the parliament. Only when the parliament was jammed, okay, they refused, didn't allow it to function. Then only he ordered inquiry, etc. So the point is, you cannot ask for information and get it. You have to get the information here in India. If Hassan Ali case is very important for that reason. Hassan Ali case is important why? Because most likely all top businessmen, bureaucrats and politicians from West India are using Hassan Ali as a conduit for Haram. In his hard disk, you could get the data. Just like the Jan Hawala case in 1991, there 52 names came out of the politicians and 2 of them admitted. Okay, Sharad Yadav and L.K. Advani. Admitted L.K. Advani said that the money came from the party. Only these 2 admitted out of 52, but nobody is prosecuted. So if you catch Jain, then you get the 52 names, you can prosecute. If you catch Hassan Ali and act immediately, you get the names, you get a few hundred politicians, etc. So catching here is important. Then you can get the money back. You can't catch them there. That's it.
So all the HSBC list of Swiss bank accounts which have investigated, 50% have been found to be completely genuine businessman accounts in the Swiss bank. They are not politician accounts.
No,
Because the state accounts only are genuine accounts. All the others are through shell companies. So they are never attributed to anything.
No, but you see, if the French government can bribe and get this list, you know, if the LTG bank list could be got by the Germans, the Indian government could be also proactive, and there are all these, you know, the various islands and the various tax havens could also get lists, knowing that a lot of Indian businessmen, politicians, etc. So you see, why would the government act? The very people in power are the people who are using money. So why would they act? So therefore, this double taxation avoidance agreement is a complete farce. Because double taxation avoidance agreement is about your white income, not black income. So double taxation avoidance agreement means if I have a white income here, I will be taxed here, not here. Or if I am taxed here, then I will not be taxed. So that doesn't give you any information about the black income. For black income, you need to know whose black money has gone out and where is it lying. That information you can get. So we have to activate the tracking of black income generation here in India to tackle that problem. So Baba Ramdev called me, I explained this to him. So he toned down his thing a little bit.
So Satyam auditors lied on the balance sheet, but the Satyam people in the income tax department should have known about this. Why were they not prosecuted?
See, you think of the income tax department. How much time does an income tax officer have for any? For a small account like mine, he might spend 20 minutes. For a big account like Satyam, he spend half a day. And auditors and income tax officers spend 3 months preparing that account. So there's no way in half a day he can know what's going on in that account, right? So that's why these matters are settled. As far as I know from the chartered accountant, just come to a settlement. This much will be paid, you accept this kind of income and that's what is done, right? So that's why in one of the suggestions I've made is that income taxation should be greatly simplified. I've been making this suggestion since 85. All these 80C, 80CC, 80D, 84, 24E, 23E, 54E, etc. all should be eliminated. That was simple. That's what the direct tax code hopefully will do. Okay? Simplify it. So don't have to file so many papers. And as far as corporate tax is concerned, tax on gross profit rather than net profit. Because in going from gross profit to net profit, the entire expense of the management is put on the company. So if it's on gross profit, it doesn't matter whether after the tax has been paid, whether I go to 5-star hotel or whether I go to Switzerland, that's all from my post-tax income, right? So make it simple, then you will be able to implement it. Otherwise, implementing corporation tax is almost horrendous. And where does the income tax officer have more than 3-4 hours to look at, say, Dhirubhai Ambani's account? And Dhirubhai Ambani is clever people who have manipulated the accounts left, right and center. Only now that it's come out that Reliance has 120 subsidiaries, but they probably have 2,000 subsidiaries. And we still don't know what the remaining. See, when Fortis Bank in Netherlands collapsed in 2008, and Netherlands government took it over, they found Fortis Bank had 700 subsidiaries in tax havens. Your Citibank, all these UBS banks, etc., they are the conduits for taking money out of the country. Why is the government not acting on that? So much is known.
Sir, what has been the history of black money in India? It was mentioned that it's more of a post-independence phenomenon, and it has been rising since 80s more. But the way Indian society functions, so many social inequalities and other distortions in our society, it should be a long-run phenomenon and should be having the historical perspective. So, what was the component of black money during the British period, and how the British government used to tackle it?
See, this black economy phenomena really dates from the Second World War, when the shortages came, and there was a lot of rationing and other things. Before that, and even now, as I said, 3% is where the black economy is concentrated. It's not that a poor fellow will not want to be corrupt, but he has no way of being corrupt. So 97% of the people have no chance of making black income. They don't lie in that tax bracket. Only 3% are there. So by and large, we are an honest nation in that sense. Even though a lot of people may want to get their daughter married to a corrupt person, a lot of them may aspire for some corruption, etc., but they have no chance of making it. So by and large, they are honest. And going back to the 50s, that level of honesty was much greater. And going back to the British period where there's hardly any public dealings. Most people hardly had any public dealings. Other than the police or the district magistrate, there was no public dealing of any kind. Right? So the levels of corruption were very low, the levels of black economy were very low, and that's why Caldo, when he measured it, came to a figure of 4 to 5% in 55, 56. So if you go back to the British period, it would have been 1 or 2%, very small. You see, most importantly, the British did not tolerate corruption because they wanted to govern India. You see, they wanted efficient administration. That's why the civil servants were like lords, like the king. ICS officer was a king. He got a huge salary, right? The police officer got a huge salary compared to the average person, right? So that time the British wanted control, and for that you have to have efficient administration. So you did not tolerate that. There was no election. Okay? So therefore, all these phenomena which are linked to the political class, which are linked to the business class, which are linked to the executive, they all started thriving after India. So that's why under the British rule, they had a limited purpose: control the country to extract surplus from the country. And they did that in a huge way. Rest didn't matter. Investments were very poor, education was very weak, health was very weak. So therefore, there is no distinction.
But all the East India Company directors took a lot of black money to England and bought.
They looted. That was official.
That was officially looted.
No, meaning that was in a sense of official loot, because they were the owners. They were looting, right? So drain of wealth was what was called later on. What was a loot by them that became the drain of wealth, because the British then formally started taking out the capital from the.
But even in 1947, Winston Churchill was talking in the British Parliament that if you make India independent, the power will go into the hands of corrupt like Nehru. So there must have been some corruption paradigm in the British.
That was colonial attitude. Colonial attitude was that these fellows are uncivilized. So you read Macaulay's Minutes. In my latest book that should come out next month, I've done all this analysis. Macaulay's Minutes. So what does Macaulay's Minutes say? That these people have no learning. The entire knowledge of the Orient is one big cupboard of a big library of Europe. So let's teach them in English. And we need to create a class in between us and the common people. So create the civil service which will act as a buffer. And teach them in English. If you teach them in English, they'll never be original. So till date, they are all derived intellectuals. So we derive our knowledge system from the West and recycle it. So if I am teaching sociology, I will teach Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Popper, Lacan. So Srinivas is also derived out of Durkheim's work. Or if I am teaching economics, I will teach Arrow, Samuelson, Solos, Stiglitz, this, that and the other, now Krugman, etc. But where is the Indian theorizing? Black economy is so crucial, but apart from me, who's doing work on the black economy? Because everybody just borrows the model. So Gurdey and Shaw fit Indian data and do the analysis. In AIMS, get a procedure from London or from Pittsburgh and do the data for British journal. So where are the original procedures being done in AIMS? What is the new thing being done in the IITs or the IIMs? Where is the new research? What are the great discoveries? What is the new research being done in Infosys or in Wipro? They are cash rich, so do no research. Because we have become, enslaved in the mind. And that's what Macaulay is. So I call Macaulay the greatest thinker of India in the last 100 years. He knew how to keep us enslaved even after independence. Okay? So he has had the most massive influence. Gandhi, who tried to counter all that, and I've discussed that in my book, we put him aside. So even the Congress party did not do what Gandhi suggested after 1935. So Gandhi in his India of My Dreams in the 1920s says India is the only country capable of giving a civilizational alternative to the world. No other country can do it. Same Gandhi in the 1940s says even India has gone down that road. Can't help. Okay. So you see, originality in India has been killed in a very vast way. We're only copying. So all this high tax rate hypothesis come from where? From the West. We copied and tried to apply it here. All these theories of economics are coming from where? From there. But our system the same as theirs. We have caste system, but we still talk of class. We talk of transition from feudalism to capitalism. That is the most important debate. But caste we never theorize about. That was the most important reality. So our intellectuals are derived intellectuals. We derive our knowledge system and recycle it. So originality is not there. Anyway, we can keep on talking about wider issues, but I think